E-commerce changes things, turns everything on its head. And the beauty of it is, instead of you as a consumer going into a brick and mortar store and looking for what you want, right? E-commerce allows the consumers of the world to come find the seller rather than the seller, marketing to particular demographics of different countries. It's the buyers looking for the sellers. And so that really, flips things on its head.
Before we get started with the show, here's a quick word from our sponsor, Global Training Center. As trade compliance professionals, you want to make sure that your procedures and documentation are completed as correctly as possible to avoid any delays and possible fines. We provide a range of trade compliance courses that will fit your needs. From in-person or web training to recorded on-demand courses, we can train one or even thousands on your team through your learning platform or on our portal. We can even customize a private session for your team. Go to globaltrainingcenter.com to find out more.
Hey, Andy. So we're back after a long weekend. I know this show is airing a few weeks after Memorial Day weekend, but I'm just wondering how your weekend was.
Oh man, it's like had a busy weekend for me. Actually had some family issues, and then get this, didn't have anything. It's like all of my friends were and folks were going to the lake and enjoying or barbecuing or whatever. I wound up spending 6.5 hours cleaning my daughter's car. She pits out a car worse than anybody I've ever seen, and that is like. My daughter and son-in-law have been busy, and they now have a 5 months old. So yes, I am a grandfather, and it's been great. But anyway, so I went ahead and spent all that time. It took me 2 hours just to vacuum it out. That's how bad it was. That gives you any idea. I'm sorry, Julianne. It's like I'm not trying to embarrass you, but anyway, it looks good. It's clean. She's very appreciative of it. So that's what I wound up doing. How about you?
How funny that you say that, because we actually visited my son in Seattle. He's out on his own now and in Seattle, and we got into his car, and I was like, "Oh my God, this car really needs a clean." It's funny you say that, because I was tempted on going to the car wash and getting it detailed, but
you wonder, is like, aren't you embarrassed to have anybody ride with you?
Yeah, but we were really lucky. Got to see the first game of the 3-part series of the Yankees and the Mariners. So we saw Yankees.
Go Yankees.
Game one. Yeah. Yeah, heck yeah. And we saw Aaron Judge hit a couple of home runs that night. So it was a fun game. It was actually a really fun game.
Well, I am hoping that everybody had a great time. And to our listeners, listen, listen, obviously that's being redundant, isn't it? Thank you for what y'all are doing. Please, like us, download us, whatever. We are so thankful. You may need to start putting some comments from people in LinkedIn. We're going to do some things to show you how to do it on Apple or whatever, and make some comments, I guess, or rate us. But we thank you so much for what y'all are doing. Today's show, I'm really excited about getting to talk about. We're going to get into e-commerce. Gee, that's one we've talked about a few times, and people talk about it initially, but it's on different aspects. But we have somebody on that's been a good friend to both Lalo and myself, and Marianne Rowden. So she left AAEI, and then I'm going to let her talk about the organization she's with. But with that, I'm looking forward, Lalo, to this discussion, and also let's bring Marianne on. So, Marianne, welcome to our show and Simply Trade.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to do this podcast with you.
Great. Well, thank you, Marianne. And I'm glad you're here, because, I mean, honestly, on our side of the business for Global Training Center, it's funny how we get a lot of calls and a lot of inquiries on people who are doing e-commerce, because most of them are small businesses, right? I mean, they're just people that decided to open up shop on Etsy or Amazon or, wherever, and they're doing some form of e-commerce. And obviously they're the ones that know the least, because, they they're like, you mean I have to import this? Now I need to export this, and I just sold something to another country or whatever. And so I'm glad that we're having this conversation because we could at least direct them to this podcast episode if there are any questions. So thank you for coming on.
Thank you. And, it took me, so I'm an international trade lawyer by training, started doing transportation law. And, I headed AEI for, 12 years. And it took me a long time to understand the significance of e-commerce and why it was so important. Because, either as a trade attorney or with AEI, it's primarily multinational corporations that are really involved in trade policy and trade operations. But what I noticed is that ever since the financial crisis of 2008, e-commerce numbers were getting bigger and bigger. So the statistics I was looking at is traditional trade, containerized trade, was growing maybe 5%, if that. But e-commerce was growing around 20%, between 14 and 20%. And it took me a long time to figure out what that meant and why it was significant. And I felt intuitively that they would have to be brought into the trade community. And, we kind of looked at, because at first, the marketplaces were neither fish nor fowl. They were not the owner of the goods as an importer or exporter, but they didn't see themselves as service providers either. And we just happened to look at that a couple of trade directors who are friends of mine started at the marketplaces. And that was like the first inkling that I had that the best trade talent was moving to e-commerce. Okay. And by that time, we're talking about now 2014, the marketplaces were having to deal with all the regulatory issues for both importing and exporting. The other thing that happened is, as the CEO of AAEI, we had a seat on the World Customs Organization's private sector consultative group. And I guess you would call it like the COAC of, international trade for an multilateral organization. Now, technically, the World Customs Organization is not part of the United Nations bodies like the World Trade Organization, but they do have MOUs with all those bodies because the WCO does implement a lot of those treaties, and it does have treaties itself.
Hey, hang on just a second, just for a minute here. Forgive me for jumping in, but for those that are listening, when you hear us say the World Customs Organization or the WCO, what that means is and the best way I describe it, it's like a trade association for customs entities from each of the countries around the world. So it's where they get together as customs to customs, representatives thereof. And you were talking about how they're the ones that actually talk through how to implement or how to enforce different trade trade agreements or treaties or whatever, and they talk about literally sharing information on that. So just so folks understand, if you're going, well, I hear about WCO or World Customs Organization, I know that they are a lot of times out of Brussels, which is where their main offices are. But that's what that is. So think of WCO as a trade association for customs groups from different countries.
The World Customs Organization has the harmonized tariff schedule that's updated every 5 years. So they administer the tariff, even though it's adopted as domestic legislation for each country. Another example is the valuation code. Now, that was adopted through the GATT and the World Trade Organization, but it's actually enforced through the World Customs Organization. So those two quick examples that people may be more familiar with. So this private sector consultative group was really convened back in 2005 to advise the Secretary General of the World Customs Organization on supply chain security, what we think of as the Authorized Economic Operator Program, or the U.S. version of CTPAT. But the Secretary General did task the PSEG to look at other issues. And when I saw the numbers changing on e-commerce being more and more trade, and before I go too far, e-commerce can be in the eye of the beholder, and we have to be somewhat disciplined in how we talk about it. So if you order anything online, that is e-commerce. Now, the question is, when that package that you order online is presented to customs, does it matter that you order it online or not? In some ways, it really shouldn't. But when we talk about e-commerce, we talk about low-value physical goods, okay, as opposed to digital goods, which we can get to later. But when I saw the numbers, I went to my colleagues on the PSEG and I said, we really should take up this issue because it's going to be a bigger percentage of global trade, because particularly Amazon, but the other marketplaces did what many people didn't think could happen, and that's a change in consumer behavior. So people got comfortable with ordering goods online and paying for goods online. And the consistency through which those goods were delivered and people were satisfied with the quality and the price of the products really changed that consumer behavior.
To that point, let's stop for a second again, though, is that, let me just say this. When we're talking about e-commerce, especially some people that are talking about in their businesses, well, I need to get into e-commerce, or I need to expand into e-commerce. The one thing, they're like, okay, there's this mystic thing, or, oh, it's really complex. Let's back up. I always come back and, me, I'm dumb as a box of rocks, so I got to keep it simple, right? And e-commerce is just a newer term. It's a modern day term for the catalog business. So the old days, Sears and Roebuck, how many times as a kid, man, you couldn't wait till the Sears and Roebuck catalog came in the mail, and you'd grab that out of the mail, and you go in and you're laying down in the floor of your living room, going through, making your Christmas list and circling things and all that. But that catalog business, along with others that have been out there and all that, they would have the mailers and what. That's all we're talking about here is a business selling their goods. It used to be the catalogs. Now it's online catalogs, if you will. When you're looking online, it's the same deal. And then you order, and now it's much faster. You order it, you pay for it all online and whatever. Hence the electronic version, the electronic commerce, hence e-commerce. So as we're talking about that, that's the other thing, is that what's changed, again, from catalog to now e-commerce, you have to order things, and you're doing it predominantly electronically. I mean, I would say, 99% of it is probably done electronically.
Yeah, and the phrase
right?
that's used really is, in the industry, is either multi-channel or omni-channel, at least in the retail industry. That's the phrase that they use, because many companies can be brick and mortar and sell online, so Nike is a great example, and a lot of retailers do have what they call multi-channel. They may be selling in brick and mortar stores, or they'll be selling online. And to go back to what I talked about earlier, it took me a long time to realize what was so different and important about e-commerce is e-commerce turns everything on its head. And the beauty of it is, instead of you as a consumer going into a brick and mortar store and looking for what you want, right? E-commerce allows the consumers of the world to come find the seller, rather than the seller, marketing to particular demographics of different countries. It's the buyers looking for the sellers. And so that really, flips things on its head.
Well, it also allows a scenario where a small company, a mom and pop company, an individual actually, or can compete somewhat effectively against the big companies. It's like in the e-commerce world, you open up an e-store, electronic type store type scenario where you're advertising, if you will, on whatever platform, you're able to compete right off the bat. Now, you still have to, supply your goods timely and at a good price and the cycle times and all that. If you don't, you won't be in very long. But that's one of the things that we need to do is look at it. So,
and that's true. It also offers consumers so much more choice. I mean, that's what's incomparable about it. So what ended up happening at the WCO is I was quite buoyed by the fact that all my colleagues agreed wholeheartedly that, customs administrations really needed to address e-commerce. And what was happening for many countries is the customs administrations were dealing with what they called the tsunami of packages. And we were very fortunate in that an American by the name of Ana Hinojosa, who came from U.S. Customs, was elected to Director of Trade Facilitation and Compliance at the World Customs Organization. So I said to Ana, we should take this up, and she said yes. So for a multilateral organization, which is slow, they took it up right away. And I think we started in 2015. I was honored to be elected by the PSCG to be the private sector co-chair. And we started multilateral plenary session negotiations. So we had 250 people in a room. Not only the Customs Administration delegates from each country that wanted to participate, but we also had a representative from the World Trade Organization, the Universal Postal Union, OECD, and these other organizations, as well as the private sector, most of the marketplace platforms, the express air couriers. It culminated after 3 years, I think, or maybe 4 years, to 2019, issuing the WCO's framework of standard for e-commerce. So the WCO is actually the first international organization to come up with a non-binding agreement for the treatment of e-commerce. And that was very significant because the World Trade Organization had negotiations on their work program for electronic commerce that has been going on for years and is still not concluded.
We love Ana Hinojosa. She's been on our show, and we talked about actually the forced labor side of it. But I'm very familiar with Ana's as a reputation. I didn't get to actually meet her on some things, but I was was very well respected, if you will, and was a great representative of the U.S. and CBP and in that forum. So it does not surprise me that she was a great ally and champion the effort that you were talking about there. That said, the one thing I will say is that I agree with when you were saying it's a non-binding agreement, but folks, what that means is that with the WCO putting that out with so much input from the private sector consulting group and the other trade associations and all that effort, it's kind of like, what do you call it? Explanatory notes, I guess is how you say it. Excuse my dumb Southern way here. Explanatory notes on, classification, where you have your chapter notes and then you go into a little bit more detail, and it gives guidance to customs inspectors, if you will, and those that are writing the regulations on what the thought is behind some of that. So that's phenomenal, Marianne, as far as in looking at that. So here's the question, though. So what? What has anything come of that? Is there, or where are we at in today's world?
Well, I think the fact that 200 countries, or close to 200 countries, were able to agree on definitions. You have a map of both the postal and non-postal, or the postal and the express supply chain for e-commerce, that all that is laid out is important as a marker, if you will. and got countries to think about how to develop their e-commerce systems. I was the private sector co-chair for all 3 years, and then Noam Shank of UPS finished up at the end. But my first co-chair was Australia. Okay. They had a very high de minimis of $1,000 and they wanted to lower it. And they also had VAT issues and they were doing other customs reform. So they were looking at what kind of model. So Australia and New Zealand had done some research, preliminary research. The second year, my co-chair was from China. Okay. And of course, what most people don't realize is that Alibaba is the retail distribution system for China. And
right. It's the Amazon of China.
They had a very unique experience in that they rolled out, I guess, a regulation first for e-commerce, and they had to pull it back. And they had to redo it, because of the e-commerce companies. Now, to be fair, most of the e-commerce companies in China are export-oriented. Most of their stuff goes to export markets, but they do have a very large domestic market. Now, the import system, for China was very strict. They had 99 data elements, and each Chinese citizen is limited to only $3,500 of, e-commerce ordering online. And they do it for tax reasons. So in China, the customs regime for e-commerce is totally separate than traditional trade. My co-chair the third year was from Canada. And what was happening is Canada is they would get entire container loads of trucks serving the US market. So my co-chair was with CBSA, but he was delegated to the postal processing. And so he said that, his first day, he had to deal with a container that had 80,000 manifests in a single container.
Yeah, I was going to say there'd be thousands, tens of thousands of shipments in that. Yep.
So that gives you the variation that you see. And of course, one of the other things that happened that I detected when, you're sitting in a room that's like the mini United Nations, and you have countries seated in alphabetical order. So you have a lot of developing countries sitting right in front of you as I was on the dais. And there are some countries that don't have electricity 24/7, right? Trying to deal with this. There were some countries that remarked, but we've always done it this way. They don't want to see the change. And so what I tried to tell them is, most developing countries get most of their national revenue from customs duties and VAT. It's the developed countries, the US, the EU, Japan, Canada, that get most of their national revenue from income tax. So I would always say to countries, particularly the developing countries that were very worried about losing tax revenue, I would say to them, how do you want to grow your tax base? It's much easier to grow your tax base if you have a population with increasing incomes than just more and more taxes from VAT and customs duties.
Well, and also as you're talking, that's a great question in there. But let me one of the things that so often governments look at all this tsunami of packages in the e-commerce and, oh, well, we're losing out on duty or taxes, whatever on that. But here's the other thing. The cost of doing an entry for a low dollar item like that is going to be more than the revenue that you would gain. So the scenario there is that too often governments will look only at one facet. That's revenue I'm losing versus if you look at it holistically, it actually is being more productive if you come up with a way to deal with that in a mass scale because you actually are still stimulating trade. Things are still you've still got movement, but it's saving you money from having to process and spend, let's just say in theory, I may have to spend $100 to process an entry for a low dollar item and get maybe $2 in revenue of it or whatever. And I mean, and when I say $100, I'm talking about the inspector's time, the broker's time, the systems, the billing it out, or whatever you're doing. Good night. You're not getting, that's the thing that when we're talking about e-commerce and some people are strong advocates going, oh, we got to stop this. We got to go after it. But if you look at it holistically, it's like, well, wait a minute. You're going to spend $100 for $2 revenue? That doesn't make sense.
Because the United States, we had a de minimis, and I think it started in the Tariff Act of 1930, and it was $1, and then it was raised to like $5. I'm trying to think of when, but we did the history of it. It might have been in the 1950s. And then it was raised up to $200 in the 1986 Omnibus Reconciliation Act, which the audience should know that was part of the big tax cut, the Reagan tax cut. So that was 1986.
Wait a minute. Let me also say, Claire, just a point of clarification. It was actually, the statute said $250. However, customs and all that took it to $200. They still had 50 without, but they, for whatever reason, it was $200. If I'm not mistaken, that was primarily due to the JFK Brokers Association that was pushing back on that a little bit.
Could be. You could probably be right.
Just a point of clarification. But anyway, all right, so it's $200 for a long time.
And then that gets us to, so that takes us to about 2014, 2015. So around the same time as the WCO is doing its negotiations. And we, of course, are all involved within AEI of, negotiating what became the Trade Facilitation Trade Enforcement Act. And that raised the de minimis from $200 up to $800. Now, there were lots of arguments, and it was the Express Association of America who was the primary association pushing for it, but AEI and the rest of the trade supported it. There was a couple of reasons why we did this. Number one, so we did it to deal with inflation because it hadn't been raised in so long. But then the other reason was, when you travel internationally and you come back into the United States, you get that little blue form. I'm trying to think of what the form number is. But your personal exemption to bring in goods from overseas is $800. So they thought you could do parity. Now, I mean, theoretically, I guess you could cross borders every day. But what makes the de minimis for goods unique is it's one shipment per day per trader. Okay. And that $800 is the value is based on the foreign market, not the U.S. market in terms of value. Okay. So the controversy we have today is e-commerce or the cross-border shipments of low-value goods, because, again, e-commerce is not necessarily de minimis, although there is a correlation, skyrocketed, right? But what I never anticipated was something like a global pandemic, that those numbers went off the charts, okay? So what's happening now with Congress is there's a big push to either lower de minimis or shut it down. And unfortunately, I think members of Congress are conflating a bunch of issues. Now, I think this is driven by consumer behavior, okay? Because our calculation is the average value of a low-value shipment under de minimis. Our calculation from industry sources is that the value of the average de minimis shipment is $50. So it would meet even a lower threshold that we had in 1986, okay? I do think there may be some truth, but I don't know how we can prove this, that some Chinese companies were trying to avoid the Section 301 duties. Okay, so that was another factor that happened during that time. So Members of Congress who want to shut down de minimis, I think, are conflating issues. And now, to be fair, also, the European Union has come out with their reform package for the EU Customs Code, and they will eliminate their $150 euro de minimis for customs duties. They already eliminated it for VAT. And what you do now is you use one of these one-stop shop companies. The United States, well, certain members of Congress, principally Representative Earl Blumenauer of Oregon, he is the ranking member of the Trade Subcommittee, introduced a bill last year, the Import Security and Fairness Act. And that would, they don't name China in that bill, but they have criteria that only China fulfills, would block de minimis treatment for shipments from China. The European Union has just released, I think last week or so, its reform package of the EU Customs Code. And in that package, the European Union would eliminate the 150 euro de minimis for customs duties. Now, they already eliminated their de minimis for VAT. And so in 2021, e-commerce companies had a hard time, going to every member state that they owed VAT to. So what the European Union did is adopted a regime called Importer One-Stop Shop, IOSS. And you sign up with one of these companies and they pay all your VAT and all remitted to all the member states, okay? So now they want to eliminate the customs duties, de minimis in the European Union. So it is a trend that is happening. And of course, many developing countries have a very low de minimis. I think the average is probably around $50. China, I think it's $9. So it's pretty low.
Well, Canada's is very low too.
Well, this is the interesting thing about Canada and Mexico. So we at AEI, one of the priorities we had was increasing the de minimis for Canada and Mexico. And we actually got that in. So Canada was $20, and I think it went up to $120 or $150. So Canada had a very low de minimis. I think it was $20. And Canadian retailers were very powerful. But we wanted to get it raised through USMCA, and we did. It got up to like 120 or 150 Canadian dollars. My understanding in talking to people in Canada is that Canada has made the process so hard to use de minimis that a lot of people don't use it, even though we got it raised.
Well, and the sad thing about that is that it really hurts the Canadian consumer. It doesn't hurt it. I mean, it's the service providers that are standing in the way. And that's the one thing is the Canadian consumer is having to pay more because of, in this case, certain businesses are standing in the way. They are used to being the middleman and they want to stay that way. Oversimplification, but
an analog to look at is the sales tax in the United States. So I think it was back in 1995, the Supreme Court issued a ruling on the Quill decision that said if an e-commerce company or any company didn't have a physical nexus to that state could not collect sales tax, on that product that was shipped to a consumer in that state. It was almost exactly 20 years. So then in 2018, the Supreme Court reversed that Quill decision in a decision called Wayfair. And I was shocked at the time that they overturned such precedent on something that is so clear. But I've been keeping up with, how the domestic side of collecting sales tax, has, been happening. And even though that decision was in 2018, and we're in 2023, it's still chaos. And there's a multi-state entity that will help companies remit taxes, just like the Importer One-Stop Shop in the European Union. So there are, analogs between the sales tax and the customs and VAT. So if we get, right now internationally, there's a moratorium on customs duties on electronic transmissions, which is more on the digital side. But if that ends, you're going to see the same chaos internationally that we're experiencing domestically with sales tax.
All right. So for those that are listening, again, when we're talking about a tax on digital transmissions, it can cover a whole host of things. We've touched on it a little bit before, but in that, the only way to really look at, dealing with the digital transmissions is the government's going to have to be putting and working with the ISPs, the internet service providers, is going to have to be working with also, businesses dealing with transactions. So the scenario there is where does it come into play? It's not just isolated to international borders. It's also looking at, if I want to download a song, there'll be an extra fee or tax on that. If I want to, if I do a search, it could literally come into a scenario where, now this is maybe going overboard, but I mean, if I start searching for things, well, there may be taxes involved in that, and it hits your ISP, which in turn hits the government. Or it could be that if I buy something online, there's an extra sales tax just for the digital transaction, not just for the sales tax of the goods. It's like that for lack of better terms, I'll say, had the convenience of doing it online. So the government says, well, that's a service and there needs to be a digital tax on it or something. It doesn't mean that's going to happen. It just means that's some of the things people are talking about.
Well, it could be two taxes. It's the actual tax on the electronic transmission itself, and then a customs duty in the tariff classification, in the harmonized tariff schedule. So you'd actually be subject to two tax, and those countries that have a VAT.
It's a growing industry, if you will, from transportation to the import export and it's a key stimulating item of for different countries' GDP actually as well. So. Thank you so much for our listeners. Again, thank you for being avid listeners to our Simply Trade podcast. Again, you have been just phenomenal. We appreciate y'all's support. Lalo, any last comments from you?
No, that's just it. If I just want to remind everybody, if at any time you feel like this episode might have gone like 30, 35 minutes, always check our YouTube channel and our website, because you will get links to the full thing. If it's an hour, it's an hour for
the video
for
portion of it.
The video portion, right? Yeah, and because we sometimes might take excerpts and put this together. Although Mara, our producer, does an amazing job at making it sound like that was the whole interview, but it sometimes is not. There's actually quite a bit more in some cases, and this might be one of those cases. So just check our YouTube channel for Global, and again, check the show notes. That's where you'll find it, and then you can find the rest of the stuff in there. So that's about it. That's all I wanted to make comment on.
And last thing I'll just mention is that reach out to us on LinkedIn if you don't mind, and try and connect with us, follow us, whatever. I greatly appreciate that. And you definitely reach out to Marianne Rowden as well, and check her organization out as well. Folks, have a great day. Take care.
Thank you very much for joining us. Simply Trade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest in the show or would like to sponsor Simply Trade or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com, or you can DM us on Twitter at simplytradepod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. Simply Trade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by Simply Trade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.